In 2005, a man named Byju Raveendran began teaching Indian students how to pass India's CAT.
If you talk only from the math point of view. Now, they are adding at any time, the AI sessions can only be better if you are just relating it to the logic which we use for solving math questions.
And over the span of a decade and a half, he became an education god.
Heard of him first when in Manipal we found a rush of young people going to a class. And when we inquired as to why they're doing that, we found that there was a person by the name of Byju Raveendran who was taking classes for them to enable them to pass their classes in the IIM, and they were very, very happy with him, and the success rate was extraordinarily high.
His name was everywhere. Backpacks, hoardings, jerseys, pretty much every kid in the entire country knew who Byju was, but this story doesn't have a happy ending. Today, in 2023, BYJU'S is collapsing with a massive $1.2 billion term loan B, thousands of employees laid off, and board members stepping down. And so even though the company is named after him, there's actually talks of replacing Byju Raveendran with an interim CEO. And so in today's video, we're gonna be doing a deep dive into the tragic story of BYJU'S, from its meteoric rise, becoming India's most valuable startup, to its shocking collapse. And I don't have any personal experience with BYJU'S as a consumer myself, but Pankaj, you actually do. You were a student of BYJU'S even before they had an app, which they launched in 2015.
Yeah, so I first came across BYJU'S in the year 2014-15. I was in high school that time. And BYJU'S website had these exciting multiple choice type questions, right? You get 10 questions about every subject, and in the end, they give you an assessment. So like very exciting digitally, I would say, first experience of learning I had. And we used to share this with all our classmates. So yeah, that was my first experience with BYJU'S. Sort of before that, I'd never used technology for learning, right? It was only for gaming and other stuff. So BYJU'S was that first digital first learning method for me.
Yeah, and I think you're not alone here. There were a lot of people back in the early days that loved the company, and I've gone online and looked at some of these reviews. People genuinely thought BYJU'S was an incredible company. And so to understand how we've gone from that, this very positive consumer perception of the business, to what we're currently looking at, where there's basically widespread hatred of this company, I think we need to go back all the way to the beginning to take a look at BYJU'S before most people even knew what it was or had ever heard the name Byju Raveendran. Because I'm not sure if you know this, a lot of people don't know this, but back in the early days of the company, it wasn't actually called BYJU'S at all. In fact, it had a completely different name, Noesis. So let's take a look here at this archived version of the early website. You can see in their description here that they're talking about Byju Raveendran, this zealous founder. He's a two-time CAT 100 percentiler, started the company in 2005 in Bangalore with just 25 students, and today they're present in 7 cities with over 3,500 students. So this is basically all happening offline. This is a purely brick and mortar business. You've got Byju Raveendran getting up on stage, in the beginning actually in small classrooms teaching these students, and then eventually the venues grow in size as more and more students want to be taught how to pass the CAT by Byju Raveendran. And then in 2008, we start to see a bit of a shift. A little bit lower down on the page, we can actually see that Byju is taking his course online for the first time in 2008, where it says the online classes that he started as a pilot project last year, and he's referring to 2008 here, went on to cover 6 cities and had close to 1,200 students.
Yeah, their offline presence had really grown up until this point. And the Noesis website that you talked about earlier, it was sort of the first online version of BYJU'S classes, right? And they're also going to other websites to sort of market for that. So I found this very interesting online ad for BYJU'S classes from 2009, an ad in the Times of India, where BYJU is selling these mock CAT exam for 250 rupees a test. And most of these people won't take just one test, right? They had a limit of 10 up to 10 tests that everyone could take. And if you like multiply that number by 1,200 students, you get a ballpark of 3 to 6 lakh rupees that they earned during this time.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg, as they say, right? The more and more he moves online, the more he realizes that there's actually way more money to be made in this space. But I actually want to go back a little bit, because Byju Raveendran himself is not the only founder of the company. He did start the company on his own, but he was able to kind of retcon other people in later on as founding partners and co-founders of the business. And the way he would find these founding partners was actually through his student base. So students that raised their hand most frequently and asked questions, raised doubts, he would actually spend time with those people, and then eventually he would let them join his company as founding members. And one of these people actually ended up becoming his wife. So her name is Divya Gokulnath. She graduated in 2007, and Byju Raveendran was her instructor for GRE exam prep. Did you know this? That she was actually his student?
I knew she was his student, but I don't know the story in detail.
Yeah, so they ended up getting romantically involved, and then eventually they got married in 2009. Kind of beyond the scope of this conversation to talk about their relationship, their marriage. This is all about business here, but basically half a decade after the company was started, Divya Gokulnath joins as the second co-founder of BYJU'S. But again, it wasn't called BYJU'S back then, so initially it's called Noesis. Doesn't really roll off the tongue. Most people don't know what that word means. I think it's some Greek word for knowledge or philosophy, but they decide that, yeah, a rebranding is in order here. This isn't working. And so in May of 2011, they changed the name not to BYJU'S. Again, we're still not at that BYJU'S iconic big B purple logo stage of the company. Instead, they name it to We Global, and We stands for Winning Edge. And the idea here is that they're giving students the winning edge to pass their CAT and probably other exams as well.
Yeah, and with V Global, they really focused on these interiors of India, right? I found this very interesting anecdote of a person from 2012. This guy was looking for CAT classes in Noida, and he found BYJU'S classes online. Reviews were good, and cost for it was half of what other people were offering. And the reason BYJU was able to give the same course for half the price is because he was sitting in Bangalore and he was streaming this course digitally to other cities, right? So you can see how he was leveraging technology from those days to sort of cut the costs and, spread it to more people.
And increase the revenues too.
Yeah.
And so there's way more to talk about here, the incremental steps that he's taking in this business, but I just want to fast forward to 2015 because I think it's really easy to see how you go from this purely offline business where you've got a guy on stage teaching people physically to then using VSAT to stream these lectures to people in other parts of the country. And then the next step there, of course, is appification. So you actually build this app and you don't even need to go on stage anymore because you can do pre-recorded lectures, and Byju Raveendran himself doesn't even need to teach those. He can hire other teachers. And so we're moving in this direction of scalability, right? And 2015, of course, was also the age of apps in India. Startups were really taking off. There was a lot of businesses that were getting huge valuations in the tech space. In 2015, Indian startups raised $9 billion. It was the best year on record for venture capital in the country. And you also had companies that were joining India's unicorn club. Startups like Flipkart, Snapdeal, Ola, Emobi, Paytm, Quicker, Zomato, and Mu Sigma had all joined the club by 2015. So 2015 really feels like a pivotal year for BYJU'S and really for the entire edtech scene as well, because a lot of people would end up looking at BYJU'S, leading by example and making this change from being an offline sort of exam workshop oriented company. Like many other businesses across the country, coaching and offline tuition centers, I think, is a massive industry in India. BYJU'S is taking that existing formula and that existing industry and transforming that, revolutionizing that into what we now call as edtech, right? And that category didn't really exist in 2015. Nobody was talking about it. And so now I want to take a look at their next website. They finally decide, okay, we're going to move away from this We Global thing, and we're going to move completely in the direction of this iconic big B logo branding, BYJU'S, right? It's no longer BYJU'S CAT classes. It's no longer We Global. It's just BYJU'S.
Yeah, and it wasn't just a brand pivot for them. They also moved their focus away from CAT coaching and moved to something totally new, school learning, something that we today know as K-12. And it was a breakthrough moment for Indian edtech. No one had tried what BYJU'S was trying, taking school tuitions in an app. And the app was downloaded by 20 lakh students in just first 3 months. This led to them raising a massive Series C funding round of $75 million in 2016, led by Sequoia Capital. They then raised a Series D of $50 million in the same year by Chan Zuckerberg initiative. This was the high time for BYJU'S. They acquired a bunch of companies and hired Shah Rukh Khan as their brand ambassador.
Yeah, so you mentioned Sequoia Capital, Chan Zuckerberg initiative. I think the reason why these investors were so keen to give BYJU'S their money was twofold. One was the India opportunity for them to generate revenue, and one was the global opportunity. So for the India opportunity back in 2015, a phrase that everybody was talking about was the next 500 million. Basically this imaginary segment of India's population, 500 million people, that if you just get them online and you get them into the financial system through banking or NBFCs, then suddenly you activate this sort of nascent demand that all these 500 million people have to pay for tech products like, for example, BYJU'S. Now, looking back, we realize that that really was just a myth. it was imaginary. It was something that founders would tell VCs to raise money from them. In reality, it's probably closer to like 150 million people in India that have the kind of spending power to actually invest in tech products, and specifically with BYJU'S, upskilling themselves or educating their children. That's only about 150 million people, not 500 million or more. But then the global opportunity was also very significant. These investors were factoring that into their decisions on whether or not to invest in BYJU'S. And they thought that the courses and the programs that BYJU'S was offering through their app could easily scale to a global audience. And that's why they gave BYJU'S their money, ultimately.
Yeah, and this is what I feel ultimately kills a lot of startup, right? You are a single person, you bring one investor, that investor brings 10 more investors, and before you know, you are in 10 different directions, right? Similar to what happened with BYJU'S. Their Series F was this massive $550 million round in 2018 December, led by Naspers, who is also the main investor of companies like Udemy and Brainly. And BYJU'S announced its first moves of going global around this time, especially in English-speaking countries. And they would teach kids aged 3 to 8 science and maths, something I would say no Indian company had ever dreamt of, right? They wanted to be this global edtech giant, similar to Udemy or Brainly that I mentioned earlier, but in the schools segment.
Yep. So their plan at this point was to become the #1 global edtech company. And the pandemic, when it hit, was actually hugely beneficial in accelerating the process of this happening, where there were a lot of offline companies here in India, these coaching centers, tuition centers. I don't even know what you call them because they don't have them back home where I'm from in Canada. But this was a massive offline business. And a lot of people would point their finger at BYJU'S and say, like, this is never going to work. Parents in India are just, they like this offline education, sending their kids to a classroom so that they can learn, raise their hand when they have a doubt. It was traditional, right? Suddenly, the pandemic shuts down all of those offline centers, and many of these companies barely even had a website and definitely didn't have their courses available online. They didn't have apps. And so suddenly, BYJU'S is basically #1, and all of these parents are looking at BYJU'S and saying, wow, like this is the only option that's available for my student to continue their education while they're staying at home during lockdown in this pandemic. And then also on a global level, BYJU'S had also acquired Osmo, which was a US-based education company. And so they were very well positioned in that sense as well. And that was just the beginning of BYJU'S acquisition spree.
Yeah, and I think this was the time when BYJU'S really went ballistic on growth. They acquired all these companies left and right. So their two biggest acquisition of that time, first was Whitehead Jr. that they acquired in August of 2020 for $300 million. And then Akash in April of 2021 for almost $1 billion. At the same time, they also tried going global, where they would target markets like US, UK, Australia, Europe, sort of these high-paying markets. And for that, they acquired many companies. So you have a list right here. Osmo that you mentioned recently, they acquired that for $120 million. Then they had Epic for $500 million. And finally, a startup called Tinker for $200 million.
Yeah, so at this point in the journey, I think if you're an investor or you're an employee, basically any kind of stakeholder at BYJU'S, you're just excited about the company's future. This is an upward trajectory. The company is acquiring companies left, right, and center. Revenue is coming in. Parents are signing up their kids like crazy to join BYJU'S, and the pandemic is still raging. And so, it might even be a second or third wave at this point, right? Nobody knows how long COVID-19 is going to last. And so everybody is very bullish on BYJU'S, but also the company is expanding, and they're expanding. This is not scale. This is expansion, right? The more you expand, the more you spread yourself thin, the sort of thinner the margin for error is. And this is what we're seeing, where cracks start to form in this foundation of BYJU'S that started off with this hero, this education god, Byju Raveendran, who everybody loved, but then things kind of take this appification route, and suddenly the courses are really expensive, and these pre-recorded lectures, are they really worth it? My parents spent a lot of money on this, and we live in a tier 3 city, and the sales tactics that they used to get my parents to sign up for this thing and pay for it were a little bit questionable, right? So there's these rumors, but then something big happens. This sort of very catastrophic event called Wolf Gupta.
Wolf Gupta, an example that White Hat Jr. was using.
ऐसी ही एक कंपनी ने एक फेक बच्चे वुल्फ गुप्ता नाम से ऐड चलाई थी, जो कि फेक था, मतलब रियलिटी में वैसा कोई बच्चा एग्जिस्ट नहीं करता था।
वुल्फ गुप्ता की सक्सेस स्टोरी के बारे में, पर कई लोगों ने नोटिस किया कि इस सक्सेस स्टोरी जो एक फिक्शनल स्टोरी थी, उसमें भी डिटेल्स चेंज हो रही थी। कभी वुल्फ गुप्ता की उम्र 9 साल थी तो कभी 14 साल, कभी उनका पैकेज 1.2 करोड़ का था तो कभी 150 करोड़।
The kid that they claimed that made $1 million never existed. In the lawsuit that they have open against the person that they're suing for giving them bad press.
Sometimes they say like he is making 1.2 crore rupees. In the other ad, they say like, okay, we have a better idea. How about make it $1.2 million? Pandemic is not the worst thing that happened in 2020. At least we have got Whitehead Jr.
I don't really know what to think about this. I only can say that these guys are making a lot of money.
So BYJU'S acquired White Hat Jr. in August of 2020, and it was an utter catastrophe. I mean, this was like viral across the internet, not just with Indian content creators, and like we also covered it. I interviewed Pradeep Punia while all of this was going on. He was being sued by White Hat Jr. for speaking out against the company, but there were international content creators also covering this story of White Hat Jr. And then eventually when it was acquired by BYJU'S, that was really optically a bad situation for BYJU'S. They were basically acquiring this company that had tons of negative PR and hate surrounding it. Now, the reason why a lot of people hated White Hat Jr. was because they were notorious for using misleading, FOMO-centric advertising to manipulate parents into buying their courses. And for people who weren't sued, their social media accounts were blocked, videos were taken down if they spoke out against White Hat Jr., and to this day, Dhruv Rathi's video on White Hat Jr. is self-censored to avoid a takedown. And yet, in spite of all of this, Byju Raveendran seemed pretty confident that this was a good move, that BYJU'S acquiring White Hat Jr. was a strong decision that the company was making. Take a look at this.
So this acquisition perfectly fits into two of these pillars. One, it's adding a complementary subject like coding, considered a very important future skill, combined with the fact that it also gives us an opportunity to accelerate our growth in US.
Fast forward to today, and the tone has actually changed quite a bit, where initially Byju Raveendran had said that White Hat Jr. was a good acquisition. Now he's talked about how basically within the company, White Hat Jr. is arguably their largest loss maker. It's a liability.
Akash is growing 100% year on year, or more than 100% in just in the last 12. Great Learning is growing like that. We have scaled Osmo 4x. This is a tough to integrate cross-border acquisition in US, 4x in just 2.5 years. We have a challenge only in White Hat Jr., like since we're talking about specific things here.
And the thing is, this scrutiny around White Hat Jr. sort of spread to BYJU'S as well. People started relating these like dishonest marketing of White Hat Jr. and dishonest sales tactic of BYJU'S. And slowly but surely, people started to take notice, right? It came to our radar when we interviewed Anirudh Malpani, who spoke about BYJU'S but then got his LinkedIn account blocked. As you said, people started talking about BYJU'S and their bad sales practice back in 2020 itself on platforms like Reddit, but I think in 2021 was the time when these big publications started talking about these bad practices, right? So I have this article of BBC in front of me where they're highlighting how salesmen would ask children a bunch of questions they couldn't answer in front of their parents, and then they would use this to shame their kids in front of the parents and then ask them to buy these BYJU'S course.
Yeah, I think that this is kind of where the narrative, the public narrative starts to change, right? Initially, it's this big Indian success story. It's India's most valuable startup. And everybody's really excited about BYJU'S. They want it to succeed. And also the mission is really noble, right? Educating kids around the world, and specifically in sort of the hard to reach parts of India, bringing education to the masses. It's amazing. It's beautiful. Then it starts to shift where people start to realize like maybe they're not doing this for the students. Maybe they're actually doing it for the money, which is obvious, right? Of course, you're bringing on all these investors. Of course, they're going to want to see growth, right? They're going to want to see increased valuations. To increase valuations, you need to increase revenue at any cost, right? So everybody starts to realize that BYJU'S is sort of deviating from their original noble mission. But BYJU'S also has this card up their sleeve, which is outside of the Indian market, right? They've expanded. They're in international markets where these optics, right, this negative PR that they've accumulated is not present. People outside of India don't really know about BYJU'S reputation. But of course, as we know, the pandemic winds down, kids start going back to school, and in India, BYJU'S is able to kind of continue selling their courses to parents because Indian society really does value education in a massive way, especially in tier 2 and tier 3 where government schools probably aren't that great. Private schools might be financially out of reach, but BYJU'S comes along and says, hey, I'm going to give your kid an opportunity to sort of elevate themselves out of this sort of, maybe impoverished is not the right word, but sort of lower middle class scenario, and I'm going to give them better opportunities in life. Whereas if you do that to an American parent or a European parent, they're like, my kid has already got great opportunities. Even if they fail high school, they can still get a pretty decent job and live a reasonably good life, right? And so you try to use those kinds of manipulation tactics with American parents or European parents. I'm from Canada, same thing. Like, parents are going to be like, no, just send my kid to a public school. Like, government schools aren't bad in those countries. It's kind of the norm, right? And edtech as a sort of online alternative to public schools isn't really seen as something that most parents would want to do. It's more of like a supplement for rich people, basically. So BYJU'S really struggled in those international markets and wasn't able to make the kind of growth inroads that they were expecting to be able to during the pandemic.
Yeah, and even on financial level by now, globally, things started going bad for BYJU'S. So those three companies that I mentioned earlier that BYJU'S acquired in 2021 and before, Epic, Tinker, and Osmo, the thing is, BYJU'S didn't pay cash for them. It actually borrowed a big loan of $1.2 billion. And one reason it took that loan is because that time interest rates were very cheap in the US, right? So they're like, we are getting this dirt cheap loan, so let's take that and fund all our purchases.
Rather than basically diluting equity in the company, right?
Exactly. And I think one reason it was so easy for BYJU to get the dirt cheap loan is because up until 2021, they had this good reputation in US market. But as you mentioned, things started to sort of change in 2021, towards the end of 2021. And that combined with them delaying their financial statements of FY21, something that they were supposed to submit in March of 2021, they took 18 extra months. And when it was asked to Deloitte that what was the reason behind it, I think one main reason they said that all the revenue recognition methods of BYJU'S were really flawed, right? So they were like counting the revenue in so many different ways, which they weren't supposed to. And I think that led to lenders in the US sort of being in panic, and they started arm twisting BYJU'S in paying the loan earlier. This led to first BYJU'S suing them, and in return they sued BYJU'S. So currently the entire case is in the court.
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting part of the story, revenue recognition methods. Why were they facing trouble? Why did Deloitte find this confusing? Well, if we actually dive in here, we can see how BYJU'S as a business operates, at least in India. So most of the time when you go to a parent, you say, hey, your kid, needs to be educated here on BYJU'S. And the parent says, okay, I want to sign up. How much does it cost? The salesperson will say anything between 70,000 rupees and 3 lakh rupees typically. Rarely does the parent give all that money up front, right? Typically what happens is they spread that out over a loan. And so there's these EMIs, right? These monthly installments that they have to pay BYJU'S. So when you go to a tier 2 or a tier 3 city where those parents really aren't making that much money, right? Maybe their salary is like something like 10 or 20,000 rupees per month. Typically a bank or an NBFC will not give a loan to those people because that would be a really risky loan, right? But BYJU'S wants those people as their customers because they need to show growth, right? They need to expand. They need to spread their courses out to more people in India. And so instead of going to an NBFC and saying, hey, can you give a loan to that person? And the NBFC says, no, BYJU'S says, okay, we're going to de-risk this completely. And we're going to say, we are on the hook for this loan. So if our customer doesn't pay the EMIs, we'll do it on their behalf, right? And that's actually what ended up happening because the pandemic is over. Parents are, their kids are going to school now. They don't need BYJU'S anymore. And so a lot of them just stop paying, but BYJU'S needs to keep paying those EMIs on behalf of their customers. And the Morning Context actually broke this story wide open. So full credit to them. They actually reported that at the time when they made this article, there were between 40,000 and 50,000 such cases where parents had just opted not to continue paying a loan worth between 70,000 rupees and 3 lakh rupees. So that is a huge amount of money that BYJU'S is going to have to pay back to these NBFCs. However, it's really interesting because they are recording this all as revenue, right? Even though this money hasn't been paid to BYJU'S, and in fact, even though they're losing money a lot of the time on these loans that they're giving out because people aren't paying them back, they've actually recorded this as revenue. So if a parent signs their kid up for a 3 lakh rupee course, they're putting in their books 3 lakh rupees in revenue, which is completely not correct, right? They haven't actually brought in that money. They don't have that money in the bank. And so of course, Deloitte looks at this and they're like, oh my gosh, like these numbers are completely wrong. Like, how have you recorded this as revenue? And eventually Deloitte actually ends up quitting, right? They leave. They say, you know what? We're done. We're not going to audit your books. Good luck. So this is the reason why BYJU'S wasn't able to release their financial numbers. I mean, they did end up releasing their FY21 figures, which were really not great.
Yeah, and if you look at the numbers, 4,588 crore rupees in losses, almost 20 times compared to the previous year of FY20. And the revenue grew very slightly from 2,188 crore rupees in FY20. They grew to only 2,280 crore rupees. Most of these losses were because of White Hat Junior. Almost quarter of these losses were because of just this one company.
Yeah, they had to pay the salary of Wolf Gupta.
Yeah, and next shocking thing if you see here is that that their revenue from Indian businesses had actually decreased 40%. So in FY20, their Indian business generated them 1600 crore rupees, and that went down to just 987 crore rupees in FY21.
So we're painting a picture here of this declining company, and things have continued to decline. Actually, it's been accelerating recently. So one of the big controversies was that Byju's locations, their offices, and even the house of Byju Raveendran himself were raided by India's Enforcement Directorate. And then more recently, there's actually the Serious Fraud Investigation Office under the Ministry of Corporate Affairs that might be looking into Byju's. We're not quite sure. Mint has said that this investigation is only under consideration, but Hindu Business Line has said that they're actually conducting an investigation. But why are they doing this? Why are the authorities looking into Byju's? Well, firstly, we hinted at this a little bit earlier on, but BYJU'S hasn't filed their FY22 numbers, and it's 15 months now overdue. And like I mentioned earlier, Deloitte has now stepped away. They've sort of quit. They don't want to audit BYJU'S books, and there's two reasons for this. So one, they had done some modifications to the FY21 audit report for BYJU'S, and they hadn't gotten any communication back from BYJU'S on that. And then also, they said that FY22's numbers just weren't audit ready. Financial statements and the underlying books and records literally just weren't ready to be audited. And so Deloitte felt like BYJU'S probably didn't want to be audited. They definitely weren't submitting the documents required to make that audit happen. And so they just decided to walk away. Next, BYJU'S entire board, everybody on the entire board has stepped away. They've quit. They don't want to be a board member anymore, apart from Byju Raveendran, Divya Gokulnath, and BYJU'S brother, Riju. So these people are GV Ravishankar from Peak XV Partners, Vivian Wu from Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and Russell Dreisenstock from Prosus. So the reason why these board members quit is that apparently the founders of the company, BYJU'S, just weren't listening to their investors, their board members, their stakeholders. They were kind of doing whatever they wanted. There was no transparency. They weren't sharing information with these stakeholders. And ultimately, there was just a lack of trust between board members and founders. And then thirdly, as you mentioned, the term loan B and the lawsuits that are going on with lenders. So things are getting really messy at BYJU'S. And that could be one of the reasons why people are jumping ship, why Deloitte has jumped ship, why board members are jumping ship. And also there's even employees now who are just preemptively quitting from BYJU'S because they don't want to be laid off. That could be one reason, but I think the SFIO is also looking into the company because they're thinking maybe there's something going on internally that we're not seeing, that the public isn't seeing, and that's what is causing people to leave BYJU'S, because they want to distance themselves, right? They don't want to be a part of this company when things really hit the fan and get worse than they already are.
Yeah, and amidst all these things going wrong, I think there's one ray of hope right now for BYJU'S. It's Akash. So Akash is the only subsidiary of BYJU'S right now which is making profits and good profits. So they're sort of planning Akash's IPO somewhere next year, and they're planning to raise $1 billion out of it. And as analysts are saying, they're going to use most of these money to repay their pending loans. So what I'm seeing here is they're sort of using Akash to sort of paying for all the wrongdoings that BYJU'S did in the past.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting trend that we're seeing where edtech companies are actually going offline. So it's almost like anti-edtech. They're going back to the basics, offering offline education. Unacademy, PhysicsWallah, they're all making this push. And with Unacademy specifically, I know that they're estimating that this is actually going to be the bulk of their revenue in a couple of years, right? More than 50% of their revenue is going to be coming from their offline centers. But BYJU'S is kind of in an unfortunate situation right now because yes, they do have Akash, but a large part of their business is still tied up in online. They also took this massive loan, right, that they need to pay off somehow. There's all this controversy. There's these customers that have signed up for their online offerings that still haven't paid back their loan. So there's this whole cluster of problems that BYJU'S is facing. And I think that that's going to be their undoing ultimately. But I think now you've kind of gotten a hint of my prediction, but I want to hear your prediction. What do you think is going to happen to BYJU'S in the future?
For me, I think if I'm looking into the future, 5 years down the line, I think BYJU'S has a lot to learn from other edtech players, like people like PhysicsWallah, people like Unacademy. So Unacademy recently announced that last month was their first cash flow positive month of their entire journey of 9 to 10 years.
And I think largely this is because of the offline centers too, right?
Exactly. So one thing they did particularly right was they cut off all these distractions that they were into, skill learning, blah, blah, blah. For BYJU'S, that focus part is K12, right? They have done this for 10 years and they will continue to do that better than everyone else. So they should focus on that, and to supplement that app learning, they should open these offline stores, right, to support that. And another prediction if I have to make is their valuation is currently way off the chart, right? It's $22 billion. And if you look at their revenue, it was $291 million last year. So even if you take a 20-25x multiple, that's sort of the norm, it's still around $5 to $6 billion, similar to what Process announced for them. So what I'm looking as, they have to sort of correct all these things and their valuation will come down to 5 to 6 billion. Then they have to grow their revenue every year. And then if they want to become the number one player, they have to show that in their numbers.
So I think there's this interesting part of the story that we haven't talked about yet that sort of factors into my prediction, which is much more pessimistic. I mean, you're kind of offering a prescription. This is how you save the day, right? I agree with you. If they sort of cut off all of these periphery business lines, all of these things that are sort of making them losses, and ultimately, I think layoffs are in order as well. A massive valuation cut is in order as well. Then that would actually enable them to raise more money, probably. I'm guessing their investors are probably not as willing to give them money because it's still at that crazy high valuation that is obviously not reflective of the true value of the business. But I think that's not going to happen because historically, it seems like the Raveendran family, Byju Raveendran, Divya Gokulnath, and Byju Raveendran, they just don't want to dilute, right? They really want to retain control. That's another reason why that transparency thing is not there. They're not talking to board members. They're not talking to investors the way that they should be. They weren't communicating with Deloitte because they have this sort of self-centered attitude that we're the only ones that can steer this ship. And I think that's a really wrong perspective to have. And the only way that BYJU'S could possibly course correct at this point is if Byju Raveendran steps down and is replaced with an interim CEO or a permanent CEO for that matter. I think that's the next step for this business. That's a lot of businesses, right? He was a teacher. He started off as a teacher. He's just a guy up on stage, right? He's not maybe he's learned to be a leader. Obviously, this is what founders go through, right? You have to learn leadership skills, but there's a very big difference between leading a company with a few hundred people and leading this massive global edtech giant where you're dealing with multi-billion-dollar loans. I mean, that's a completely different scale. And I think he's just not cut out to lead the company through this storm. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think one thing we don't see in Indian companies is that we see in US companies, once they are at a certain stage, they look for CEO change, right? So if a founder has sort of led the company from 0 to let's say 100 million or 1 billion in revenue, then they bring someone more experienced to sort of take them from there to next stage, to IPO stage, right? But in India, you don't see that. You see one founder sticking to his company until it's IPO and even more than that. So I think that we can see from BYJU'S, they have these global investors, and I think they might force Byju to, into that.
Well, I wish that it was easy for them to force Byju Raveendran to step down. Certainly, if they were able to, I think that they would. Maybe it would require sort of all of these stakeholders to come together and collectively vote that we need to kick this guy out and replace him. But as of now, the Raveendran family owns roughly 20% of the company, according to the ARC. And I think they got this information from Traction, so I'm not sure if it's accurate or not. But the next closest, largest stakeholder in the company is MIH Ventures, which is a subsidiary of Process, and they only own 9.1%. So they would need to team up with a couple of other investors and collectively decide that, we want to kick Byju Raveendran out of the company. And I'm sure that there are a lot of stakeholders who don't think that that's the right move. He's led the company to this growth point that they're at. And also optically right now at such a sensitive stage, kicking out the founder and CEO of the company might actually have a devastating impact on the business and the faith that lenders and other future investors have in the company. So maybe they're just kind of trying to hold on to the situation. But I feel like it's very unlikely that Byju Raveendran is going to recognize this himself. He has sort of haters on all sides right now. And oftentimes the instinct that we have as founders is to just sort of fight back, right? And I think he's in fight mode right now. He's not in flight mode. He needs to be in flight mode. He needs to leave the company and give up his spot for someone else so that the company can be salvaged. Ultimately, that's the way that this company is going to succeed and survive. If he stays at the helm, I think it's going to keep crashing and burning. It's going to decline over time. And then at some point, there's going to be this big catastrophic moment, the way that we've seen with companies like WeWork. Theranos was more of like a scam, but it was also there was this point when there was no going back, right? I'm not sure if this investigation from the fraud office is going to yield any kind of outcome. If it does, that could be that sort of death knell for the company that, there's been some stuff going on internally that is not by the book. Not sure if they're going to find anything or not, but I definitely think that Byju Raveendran needs to go.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you there. So let us know what you guys think in the comments. Should Byju stay or should he leave to like make space for someone else?
And do you think that the company is going to survive? This is something that I think a lot of people are wondering. Is this the end of BYJU'S or not? Leave a comment down below. Let us know what you think. And thank you so much for watching.